organizations such as Compass Pathways, who've driven a lot of the psilocybin work, magic mushrooms. They've been going now for coming up to a decade. So, we're hopefully going to see those therapeutics into the market, working with patients, seeing really great positive outcomes within the next 12 months.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome back to another edition of the Sourcing Stack. Our guest today has spent the past decade investing at the frontier of some of the most controversial and potentially transformative areas of healthcare and human performance. Richard Skaife is the founding partner of the Conscious Fund, one of the world's first venture capital funds dedicated to psychedelic medicine and next generation of mental health therapies. Since launching the fund in the year 2019, Richard and his team have backed pioneering companies including Cybin, Gilgamesh Pharmaceuticals, Diamond Therapeutics, Mindstate Design Labs, Albert Labs, and several other businesses working to redefine how we treat mental health, neurological conditions, and human well-being. Beyond venture capital, Richard is also the co-founder and CEO of Longer, a longevity technology platform using AI, biometric data, DNA, and epigenetics to help individuals optimize their long-term health outcomes. He also serves as chairperson of Microdose, one of the most influential media and events platform in the psychedelic medicine ecosystem, and sits on the advisory board of the Psychedelic Medicine Association. Over the years, Richard has had a front row seat to the emergence of entirely new healthcare categories, from psychedelic therapeutics and neuroplastogens to longevity, since personalized medicine, peptide therapies, and AI-driven healthcare discovery. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you on the Sourcing Stack.
Vinny, thank you very much for having me on the Sourcing Stack.
Great. Now, I wanted to understand your investment journey, like investing before the market exists. You launched the Conscious Fund in 2019, before psychedelic medicine became a mainstream investment category. What convinced you that psychedelic therapeutics would become a credible healthcare sector when most investors still viewed the space with skepticism?
I think for me, there was two pieces. I understand talking therapy and its mechanism of action. And in fact, many, many years ago, before I entered into this space, put an app out into the App Store called DigiPill, did about 3.5–4 million downloads. And we used to get tremendous amounts of end user feedback from people saying how simply listening to audio had fundamentally changed their outcomes in terms of dealing with a lot of, mental health challenges. I'd also spent time before that involved in the electronic music world, and I'd seen firsthand how people had gone into rave culture, and everything which surrounds rave culture had really changed as human beings. If you take England in the 1980s and 1990s, football hooliganism was almost a national sport, mainly young men drinking large amounts of alcohol and having a very high propensity towards violence. You took those same individuals and you embedded them into rave culture and everything else that surrounds it, and they became very, very different people. So there'd been obviously a space for this type of therapeutic for many decades earlier. In fact, some people would suggest many centuries earlier. But it was really taking that known, respected wisdom and applying the rigor and discipline of bringing a licensed therapeutic to market. And that's what got me really, really interested. I knew there had to be an alternative way of dealing with what was an acute mental health problem that we had in 2019. And of course, as everybody will remember, in 2020, COVID came along, the world went into global lockdowns, isolation. Young people in particular were, particularly affected from their mental health. And there then became a much bigger focus on developing new and innovative therapeutics for mental health. And it's really true what you say. I mean, we were incredibly early in the space. You would tell a fund administrator what area of work you were doing, and the first thing they would do is like, I think I'll need to have a conversation with my compliance department before we can even have another telephone call. You would tell a bank what area you were working in, and they wouldn't reply to you again. So the label which came with operating in this space was incredibly stigmatized, alongside the area that you are ultimately working towards helping people get better from, which is mental health, which is also incredibly stigmatized. So I guess that really drew me towards solving a whole host of different problems, which then manifested in what we did in setting up Microdose and the Wonderland Conference, which is now run by a gentleman called Dave Asprey, who is one of the godfathers of biohacking. We set up the Psychedelic Medicine Association. Small number of doctors joined. That's now supported by one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Otsuka. So there is this realization that the things that we were talking about only a few short years ago were actually very real, were actually very valid, and that's been tremendous to see, as well as the fantastic outcomes that we've had in terms of the companies that we've invested into.
Great. Now, the state of psychedelic medicine today, over the past few years, we've seen major clinical breakthroughs, public listings, regulatory progress, and increasing pharmaceutical interest. Where do you think the psychedelic medicine industry stands today compared to where you expected it would be 5 years ago?
In some ways, it's a little bit further behind than I'd expected, but in other ways, it is ginormously ahead of what we could have anticipated. We thought that the embracing of psychedelic medicine at a sort of presidential level would be done very, very discreetly, sort of almost behind the scenes. There was a recognition that there needed to be better treatment for veterans. The veterans organizations were wholly very much behind this, treatment. But then to watch, Donald J. Trump, love him or hate him, probably only 4 or 5 weeks ago, convey his support for psychedelic medicine, sat behind his desk in the Oval Office, was not something that I would have, put a bet on, because I didn't think it was going to happen that way. 2.5, 3 years ago, it really didn't look like it was going to happen. Maybe in the next 10 years, we thought we were really off from a timing perspective. We didn't think Big Pharma would start to show a significant amount of interest. And then actually one of our portfolio companies, you mentioned them earlier, Gilgamesh, they announced a distribution initiative with a group called AbbVie, the 4th biggest pharmaceutical company in the world. And we thought, well, that's really interesting. There was a small advance which was being paid. There was a potential for a much larger sum to come over a period of sort of 10 years in sort of licensing fee income. And that said to us, well, Big Pharma is taking this sector pretty interesting. At this point, there hadn't really been any significant acquisitions. And then we jumped forward in sort of September of last year. AbbVie acquired one of the molecules from Gilgamesh. We were one of the very first investors, if not the first investor, in Gilgamesh, and they acquired that molecule for $1.2 billion. Actually didn't buy the company. The company continues. They just acquired a piece of very valuable IP. And then only a couple of weeks ago, Eli Lilly, the world's largest pharmaceutical company, threw their hat into the ring when they announced that they'd reached definite terms with another of our very early investments, a company which started off life as Atai Life and eventually became Atai Beckley for a total consideration of $3.8 billion. And that deal is due to conclude during Q3 of this year.
Great. That's a very balanced way of looking at it. In some areas, the industry has moved faster than expected with stronger clinical evidence, growing scientific credibility, and increasing institutional interest. And also at the same time, I think regulatory hurdles and a few unexpected setbacks have reminded everyone that.
And when we look at what's really important is, patient outcomes and what therapeutics will they get access to. That's also changed. There was a sort of a belief that for these therapeutics to be delivered at scale, we're going to have to see a ginormous amount of real estate infrastructure being built, because who wants to go to a gloomy, doomy hospital to be delivered what could be ultimately a life-changing experience? What do? Put some lava lamps in the room, a nice, comfortable sofa. It's still a hospital. It still smells of detergent. So there was a belief that these centers would need to open, and then of course you've got a whole real estate challenge, not just a therapeutics and training challenge of the therapists. But what we've seen is an evolution in terms of the molecules themselves, what has become known to be capable technically, and the deals which have been done in the big pharma space, they are most certainly psychedelics, but they have different behavioral characteristics of some of the legacy psychedelics, which can ultimately last for a very long duration of time. These are fast-acting, fast duration, and ultimately can be delivered in existing clinical care settings, which means that a big part of our sort of concern around who's building the real estate is not going to manifest in quite the way that we'd anticipate it. Certain therapeutics, certain therapy styles will need to be delivered in purpose-built specialist locations. But for a large percentage of the population who need to access these therapeutics, well, this could be something as simple as being looked after in your doctor's surgery.
Right. Now, just a precise answer on big pharma's arrival. Like, you've backed companies like Gilgamesh, and we're now seeing significant pharmaceutical interest in neuropsychiatric therapies. How does the entrance of large pharmaceutical companies change the future of psychedelic medicine and mental health innovation?
Well, big pharma, whether you love them or hate them, they are extremely well calibrated machines for distribution. And being able to run distribution at scale is something that big pharma, of course, does extremely well. So that, is a fundamental change. It's also changed sort of capital markets, private capital, because there is a realization now that there is a very good exit path for these companies, and they are still in the clinical stage of development. None of them yet actually have a therapeutic which has got market access and is approved and is being prescribed to patients. These are people who've still got some time to go in their clinical development plans. What we will most probably see, I think, this year, potentially at the very beginning of next year, is one, maybe two of the very early companies actually obtain market access approval from their regulator, which in this case would be the FDA. So we shall start to see in probably less than 12 months, the first patients actually being dosed in a paid-for environment, in a non-clinical trial environment. And that's great. That is something that people have been working on for even longer than us. I mean, the group who are responsible for driving MDMA therapy forward, they were set up 35 years ago. And the gentleman who's driven that, Rick Doblin, has given the vast majority of his adult life to this cause.
Right.
And that's how passionately he believes in it. Organizations such as Compass Pathways, who've driven a lot of the psilocybin work, magic mushrooms, they've been going now for coming up to a decade. So, we're hopefully going to see those therapeutics into the market, working with patients, seeing really great positive outcomes within the next 12 months.
Right. Now, mental health, the largest unsolved healthcare problem. Despite advances in medicine, mental health outcomes remain a global challenge. Why do you believe mental health remains one of the biggest opportunities and responsibilities for healthcare innovation over the next decade?
Well, I mean, the brain is extremely complex, and what, I guess, where one therapeutic can work for one person, it may not work for another person. And that, is not completely unique to this class of therapeutics. But, typically, if somebody is given an antibiotic, it works for, the vast majority of people in a similar time frame, with similar effects. So it is really difficult to develop these medicines. The clinical trials, especially for psychedelic medicines, have to be done in a different way than conventional clinical trials. And you also then have to layer in the therapeutic element. So the condition itself, I would say, is one of the most challenging, but it is also the most stigmatized, or one of the most stigmatized medical conditions. It has always been, the proverbial elephant in the room. So that means that a lot of people simply do not come forward to talk about their mental health challenges. They hide it away, in the way that they wouldn't do if they got a broken arm or a broken leg. They will do if they've got something mental health related. So it's got complexities, from a drug development perspective, from a therapeutics delivery perspective, but also the stigma that runs in society. And it really depends on which part of the world you're in, because every single society deals with the stigmas attached to it in their own different ways. So it's really unique, I think, in that way.
Right. I mean, that's an important perspective. Unlike many other areas of medicine, the brain is incredibly complex, and what works remarkably well for one patient may have little effect on the other.
Absolutely. And there is a general underinvestment into mental health care. So I think now what we're seeing is more and more people who are comfortable being honest, or open, should I say, about their mental health conditions. So that's presenting more and more people. We live in a different world in terms of, an always-on connected society, different types of anxieties, which would have, not been present 20, 30 years ago, and now coming to fruition. So a whole range of different conditions are now starting to sort of manifest. So yeah, it is a very sort of challenging area to work in, and that underinvestment by both drug developers, but also, by national health organizations. There are many countries where, somebody is trying to access, something as simple as, say, ADHD medicine, there could be a multi-year waiting list before they can actually see a doctor to have an ADHD evaluation, if indeed some countries simply won't even look at it.
Right. Now, let's move on to the building side of it. Like you're not just an investor, you're also building longer. Focused on longevity, biometrics, DNA, epigenetics, and personalized health. What drew you from investing in mental health to building a company focused on extending healthy human lifespan?
Well, I mean, there is the sort of the clinical comparisons. There was an awakening moment for me a few years ago when I was talking to a scientist who'd moved across from the longevity space across to the psychedelic medicine space, and I realized we were actually in many ways running quite interesting sort of parallel tracks. And there are a number of psychedelics which are now starting to show, really positive signals towards their longevity benefit. And as a bit of an experiment, I think it was 2023, probably 2023, or maybe 2024. Time moves so quickly. We ran a conference, the Wonderland conference, which I mentioned earlier, now run by Dave Asprey, who is a biohacker, longevity guru. And this was the first time that the two camps had ever been at the same conference together intentionally. So we brought the best longevity scientists, the best psychedelic medicine scientists, and we put them in the same room. And some of them gave talks in areas that they were not necessarily doing day to day in their scientific work. And it kind of made people start to have a conversation. And for me, that really sort of lit the fuse in terms of, the next sort of areas that I wanted to look really carefully at. So yeah, huge amounts of crossover already existing. And, big area of focus for us in the longevity space is peptides. Peptides, very similar to psychedelics, really misunderstood, not necessarily as heavily stigmatized, but the true potential of them is not yet fully known and fully understood. So I thought that's great. I love these areas where you've also got to do a huge amount of learning and information sharing. Let's put a big focus on that.
Right. Now, shifting towards the AI and the future of healthcare, you've recently spoken about AI's role in healthcare discovery, personalization, and therapeutic development. Where do you think AI will create the most meaningful impact in healthcare over the next decade?
I think AI's biggest impact will actually be in healthcare and drug development. There's only a very small number of drugs which are currently going through clinical trials, which have been computationally designed. I actually don't think there is a single drug which has actually yet been approved for market access, which kind of shows how early we are in the curve. But what's really interesting is the speed of advancement of AI and machine learning, which is happening today, doesn't run in parallel with how regulatory pathways need to be followed. So it's fascinating watching people who are relatively new to drug discovery, but are absolute experts in machine learning, solving really interesting problems, and then just sort of say, so it should be available very soon. You're like, hey, hold on a second. No, it doesn't work like that. Just because you can actually do something and you can build out enough evidence to prove that you can do something, that doesn't mean in this world that you're going to be able to give it to people. So there is going to have to be changes in regulatory frameworks which allow for the scientific advancements, which arguably have already happened, to be fully of benefit to people at scale. I think if the regulatory pathways become available, in only a few years, we will have truly personalized medicine for us as an individual, which can be used as part of recovery, but also used as part of prevention. So when you start to move into the domain of digital twins, taking DNA data, epigenetic data, biometric data, blood works, starting to create these digital twins of humans, you're going to be able to then start to run efficacy tests on the digital twin rather than the actual human being. And then hopefully you'll be able to prescribe therapeutics to that individual, which take away a lot of the inefficiencies of a therapeutic, which you yet to know whether it will have the full benefit to that particular individual. So that's my hope, within the next 5 to 10 years. It's not that we could do it technically, because I think we're probably already there today. It's whether the regulatory pathways will become available. And regulators are going to have a really big challenge on their hands, because, there was a very famous case not so long ago of, I think he was Australian, his dog had an incurable cancer. He took ChatGPT, I think it was Grok and AlphaFold, and he synthesized his own mRNA vaccine for his dog. He sent it off to a Chinese lab, had the vaccine manufactured, sent it back to himself, and then administered it to his dog. And the outcomes are looking pretty positive so far. Nothing else had worked. So this was a real last shot. So, start to move that into humans. Anybody who's got a good understanding of Claude, can use something like AlphaFold. There's other technologies on the market like Ligand AI. You've got a potential cottage industry, home industry of people creating their own therapeutics and then sending them off to labs to have them manufactured. Do I think that's a good idea? No. But the reality is the technology kind of exists today. And if you've tried everything else and nothing else is working, then you probably will try something like that. So it's not something that I think the layperson could do today, but that's not to say the layperson can't do this in a couple of years. So I think regulators are going to find themselves in a place where, they're kind of forced in a way to evolve regulations because technology has simply outpaced. It is not the same as it was 10 or 20 years ago in terms of how a new therapeutic is ultimately discovered. But the way that it has to be advanced through clinical trials hasn't really changed in a multiple of decades. And I think that's the big thing for us to really get benefit from the technological advances which are present today. In the future, then we're going to have to look at the regulatory frameworks which support those medicines going into a patient population.
Right. So from now a founder and an investor perspective, you operate as both a founder and an investor. What is something founders consistently misunderstand about building companies in highly regulated healthcare sectors?
Well, we don't meet that many founders who want to build companies in highly regulated sectors who don't have significant amounts of regulatory experience. Biotech right now is probably one of the last categories which is not being overly consumed by AI. There's a certain stage where AI has a big benefit, but it can't go the whole way. It can't do the whole thing for you. So the quality of people who want to step into biotech is generally very, very high. And if I look at the founders that we've backed, who have been the most successful, they have generally all had a number of exits, or they've worked for major pharmaceutical companies, and they have, they've got new drugs into market. It's one of those sectors where you can't sort of move fast and break things. You can't bootstrap. You do need significant amounts of capital to advance your thesis. It is a business which typically cannot be done for less than 50 to 100 million. And if you want to go all the way, maybe $700 million to $1 billion. So, not that many founders on a relatively unproven thesis, because let's face it, until a regulator says your medicine is approved, your thesis is relatively unproven. Get the opportunity of raising 700 million, $1 billion. If you think about any other company, what they're able to show is stages of growth and stages of product market fit. We don't have those things in the same way in the biotech world. We do have clinical stages of development, but it really is a reality that you can get all the way to phase 3, the very final stage, and fail at the very, very last hurdle. And that's a business which you've invested maybe 5 to 7 years of your life. maybe longer. And you've certainly invested, hundreds of millions of other people's money to get to that stage.
Right. Interesting. Richard, thank you for joining us on the Sourcing Stack. Today's conversation explored some of the most ambitious frontiers in science and healthcare, from psychedelic medicine and mental health to longevity, personalized healthcare, AI-driven therapeutics, and the future of human performance. The future of medicine may not simply be about treating illness, it may be about helping people live longer, healthier, and more fulfilling lives. Richard, thank you for sharing your insights and vision. And thank you everyone for listening. We will see you next time on the Sourcing Stack.